don't need the transcription. There we go. All right, I think it's probably time to get started then, and I'll just keep admitting individuals as they arrive. Welcome everybody to this unusual FACE seminar, not at our usual time slot, but very privileged to have Robert joining us. And Dr. Robert McLean is a senior program specialist in policy and evaluation at Canada's International Development Research Centre, and also a fellow of the Integrated Knowledge Translation Research Network at the Ottawa Hospital, University of Ottawa. And Rob's interest lies in understanding how human creativity can create a better world, and is speaking to us. I think everybody read the blurb on your invitation and was intrigued by what it is that you're speaking about. It's scaling science, which is a belief about how we can scale research results to increase the likelihood that research will affect meaningful change for the health of people and health systems. So I'm intrigued because I'm wondering what that's all about, and I haven't heard of this before. And so welcome, Robert. Thank you very much for joining us. Before we get started, all the South Africans, if you want CPD points, I'm going to put my email address in the chat bar, and please just send me your health profession's registration number and I'll arrange for your CPD accreditation. And so with that, Robert, I'm going to hand over to you, and thank you for giving us the seminar.
Thank you very much, Sharon. I will begin just by saying, well, I'd mostly be my face here so you can see it. Thank you very, very much for the opportunity, the invitation. Professor Naledi, it's a fantastic pleasure to accept your invitation and have this time to speak with colleagues today. I'm going to put up some slides, and Sharon, I'll just ask you to confirm that they look okay on your side before I launch into this on mine.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, fantastic. So I move into presentation mode and say, excited again to be here at the seminar. And I am going to speak about this novel, but I'm going to argue a very important topic of scaling science. And I'm going to do that through a series of slides and one short video that I'll show that we've put together on the topic. Effectively, I'll first provide some background on my research on this topic. I'm going to then present the case that the science of scaling is an important, critical supplement or complement to the current domains of science. In particular, I'll work with applying it to an expansion of implementation science or applied science outside of the health sciences. And then I'm going to, through this presentation, attempt to articulate the difference between scaling innovations, which we often hear about, and scaling impact, which I think underpins and should be the aim of a science of scaling. And then I will introduce some practical implications and options. We've done a lot of work to build tools, to build approaches to actually doing the science, and are now moving that into a pedagogy to develop and build the field. And so I'm going to not move into those in full, but show you what some of them look like. See, hopefully, a response to how you think this could be useful to your work at the university. And I'm going to leave lots of time for discussion. It's a novel, as you pointed out, your own case I'm making, and I believe I'm going to try to be controversial. I'm going to try to push thinking, and so I hope there's lots of time at the end for feedback, critique, discussion, and furthering this field. And so just a few declarations. You've said it mostly in the introduction. For the last 10 years, I've worked at the International Development Research Centre in Canada. This is a research funder. And I've had the privilege there of looking across research projects around the world. And so we don't only fund health research, we also fund in areas of social justice, in climate, in agriculture, in inclusive economies. And so I think a strength of what I'll be presenting today is really that diversity of global experience, largely global South, knowledge and experience, and across multiple domains of science. And I think that's brought a lot of weight and a lot of strength to what I'll be presenting about this area of scaling science. But my background is health specifically. Before IDRC, I worked at the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, which is our SAMRC equivalent or the NIH equivalent to the United States, our National Health Research Council. I'm also appointed at the Ottawa Hospital here in Ottawa, Canada, where I sit. But I was mentioning to Jerome before we started, I am trained in the academic system in South Africa, doing my PhD at Stellenbosch with Prof. Jimmy Volnick, and doing an undergraduate studies at KwaZulu-Natal in Durban. And I do want to acknowledge, before I begin, my collaborator, co-author, and good friend, Dr. John Gargani, who's done a lot of this research and background work on scaling to build this field of scaling science with me. And so I'm going to begin with this image. And I think if there's one message I hope to leave you with through this presentation, it's that scaling is always a journey of challenging decisions. And this is an image that we chose to put on the cover of our book on this topic to reinforce the importance of that notion of trade-offs that will always exist through scaling journeys. And so the image is of Mozambique, not too far from Maputo. And on the bottom side is a banana plantation that is named actually Bananalandia. And it is so large that it single-handedly turned Mozambique from a net importer of bananas to a net exporter of bananas. And it's had many benefits for the country. It's brought good paying jobs to this region. It's brought power, roads, schools, health centers to this region of Mozambique that weren't there before. It's also brought very valuable tax revenue to the national government in the scale of that it's operating at. But on the upper side of the image are machambas, and these are small, locally owned, usually family-owned agriculture systems. And at each farm, families grow different varieties of crops, and those crops are brought to markets and exchanged. And through that system, for years, healthy human nutrition has been brought to this region. A variety of incomes have been founded and specialized skills, and agriculture has been supported in a very different way. And so a lot of the issues we've had thinking about the notion of scaling has been about why was that line drawn here? Who decides that we should have full-on banana plantations or we should have small-scale farming? Both have very different implications for human health and nutrition, very different implications for planetary health and nutrition. And it's not strictly an agriculture problem. As we look around the world to different settings, you'll see this notion of large and small existing in almost every area of human behavior. And John and I decided to write about this in our book, Scaling Impact, based on a broad range of research we've done through the International Development Research Center, looking at projects around the world that have approached this notion of generating impact with the science they're doing. And so these have all been scientific research studies in different domains, and we've looked at over 200 to synthesize for this book. And so what we present in the book, I'll go through it in some detail today, but I'll go a little beyond it too. And there's much in the book that I won't be able to touch on. But we really make the case that there are 4 principles we derive from the synthesis for scaling impact. And those principles might be thought of as facilitators or enablers of scaling impact. We present 5 cases to help bring those to life. But really, I think what underpins our argument is a shift in mindset. And that's really around moving from the notion of scaling innovations or interventions, as we often hear, to scaling impact. And through the rest of the presentation, I'm going to try to present why that's a little different. It requires some different tools and different science to support it. And good news is, if it's beneficial to anyone, I thank the University of Montreal, and I believe Dr. Gogovar is here, who helped with the translation into French. And the even better news is both editions are available for free. It's supported by the International Development Research Center in full open access. So follow the link to grab your copy. But we're not the only ones talking about scaling, and it's prevalent across domains. It's become a big topic, especially in the international sphere. And so there are scaling tools in education, scaling different formats and interventions in education. Scaling has been especially prominent in agriculture. USAID has been developing different methods for scaling up technologies. And the World Health Organization has famously introduced ExpandNet, which is an approach for scaling innovations. And in the academic literature, this notion of scaling as a science has begun to bloom. A great example is Andrew Malat, who's in Australia, and colleagues who have run reviews of different models for scaling up interventions. And they begin to develop also scalability assessment tools. So actually looking at how different interventions, how scalable are they at the outset. One of my favorite pieces in the field is this piece by Trish Greenhall, which talks about spreading and scaling up innovations for improvement. And the key messages from that paper are really quite interesting to me, and I think really underpin the argument I'll be making. The first is that there's different titles throughout the literature. Some talk about spread, some talk about replication, some talk about scaling up, some talk about building and changing systems, and I think that's okay, and I think that's good. I'm not trying to say we ought to or must use the name scaling only. But she then talks about that this is an important field, and there's really three ways that she believes we can help think about it. The first is implementation science, and it takes a structured approach to understanding how interventions work and perhaps work in multiple sites. The next level, though, is really about complexity science, and it encourages a more flexible view and understanding systems and adaptation within those dynamic systems as an important lens to really understand how scaling moves beyond implementation science. But kind of the fun example or addition she makes that I really appreciate is that beyond complexity science, as popular, as sexy as that field is in these days, social science is critically important. And social science is because humans are really the ones who draw circles around different entities and call them a system. Humans are the ones who decide where and when a system exists. We begin to use those assumptions we're making about the world as our complexity science and don't always have a full understanding of the world. So that notion of social science being an indicator of scale is critically important to understanding human behavior and how we interact with each other. And she concludes really that these three approaches are necessary to tackle the challenge of spread and scale up. And so I endorse this view, and this is effectively a summary of what I've been calling, with my colleague John, scaling science. And that really takes on those three notions to understand the technicalities, the complexities, but also the human element of moving innovations from one scale to another, where they actually affect and impact lives positively. And we first wrote about this in 2017 in this Stanford Social Innovation Review article. So what is scaling all about? I'll go through some simple examples here of some of the terms you may be familiar with or might learn from this presentation, but I'll use a simple metaphor to help try to clarify them. So scaling is probably most often related to scaling up. And scaling up is really all about throughput. So in this notion, the farmer might grow their tree larger to produce more fruit. But when we think about health sciences, we could really think about expanding our education system so that we're producing more specialists in a certain field of demand. We might think about increasing the size of a hospital so we can serve more clients or patients. Another common term is scaling out, and it typically deals with replication or site change. And so you think about, having more mobile centers to a hospital to reach different communities where they're at. You think about, changing a policy that's proven effective in one region and moving it into other regions so that the same benefits can be felt by others in those regions. Another common term in the literature is scaling deep. And scaling deep really deals with quality or the nature of change. So the farmer might leave their apple on the tree to let it taste more delicious or grow larger and sell it for more money. In terms of the health sciences, this really deals with qualitative changes the services we're offering, maybe looking at elements of equity or accessibility of programs or policies, or other types of innovations to ensure that we increase the impact that they might have. Of course, these aren't mutually exclusive. We see many different versions, and I'd argue often it's essential to take different approaches so we could scale up and out at the same time. What's talked about a lot less in the literature, however, and I think is critically important, is understanding when we are at an optimal scale, and same scaling would be the appropriate approach. What's talked about even less than that is descaling and understanding the evolution of innovations and when it might be best to stop what we're doing to yield to a next best competitor or an alternative solution. And what's really not talked about at all in the literature is this notion of not scaling. And so doing things that superficially look or feel like scaling, and we may be able to claim that we're scaling to funders or others we feel responsible to, but really we're not producing anything greater from those we're meant to benefit. And we see this all the time in the reviews we've done of projects, but very little, if any, discussion in the academic literature. And so for my take, any and all of these different ways of scaling are completely appropriate. The selection should be made based on context and what the challenge is in the particular research project. But I'm going to continue to argue this through this presentation with further examples. What really matters is not how you scale, but what you're scaling, and that should be scaling impact. And that's the difference in change for people and for planet. And the way that we measure that is much more complex than the number of times we might be, administering or offering some type of innovation. And I think that's a large shift in mindset from the way that scaling is typically discussed in the literature. And it's an important supplement or complement to the view of implementation science we focus on so deeply in the health sciences right now. So how does this relate to implementation science, or what we call in Canada knowledge translation, so the moving of research into practice? We could do worse than look at this recent tour de force in psychiatry research by Bauer and Kirchner. They do an excellent job of really introducing implementation science, what it is, and why you should care as a psychiatrist or psychiatry researcher. So I'm going to borrow from their paper, which I recommend to have a quick primer on implementation science. And they use the biomedical pipeline model to introduce the importance of implementation science. So for those of you who have been doing research since before the 90s, you'll recall we were really in a period where what was considered health research that was impactful was that which was efficacious. And so, if a clinical solution proved to be effective with internal validity, it was really considered to be a positive health contribution. However, quickly, this shifted, and we began to realize that just because a clinical intervention was efficacious, it didn't actually prove effective across populations necessarily. That was a major assumption that was being missed. And so the NIH famously calls these the two valleys of death, or the T1 or T2 stumbling blocks for biomedical innovation. And so a solution to the second challenge of effectiveness was this notion of implementation science. And I'll use the definition that was offered in the inaugural journal, or the inaugural issue of implementation science, the now very famous, competitive, highly cited journal that was offered by the editors Eccles and Mittman in 2006 in the first issue. And they talk about implementation science as the scientific study of methods to promote the systematic uptake of research findings and other evidence-based practice into routine practice, and hence to improve the quality and effectiveness of health services. And I think the words here are important, really about moving research into practice or uptake. And so implementation research was really meant to solve this third valley of death that was being identified in the through the biomedical pipeline model. And so the first was, if our clinical interventions weren't actually efficacious, if they didn't work, we were in trouble. The second was if they didn't work at the population level, if external validity didn't hold, they weren't effective, then we were in trouble. And the third was they might be effective at the population level, but are they actually being used? So are clinicians, are different healthcare actors actually putting these innovations into action? And what are the barriers and facilitators to that happening? Implementation science has been a great breakthrough to help solve these kind of later stage challenges. But what my main argument is what's missing in the pipeline is what's been sitting out here this whole time in the far left in the black box: improved public health. So I'm suggesting with this notion of scaling science that we want to put this front and center. We actually want to take the black box away. So we're examining this. And on top of that, there are a great number of questions we want to be asking, we should be asking, and we can be asking with advanced scientific methods about what improved public health or impact actually means. And you don't have to look far back in our history to understand just how important and how devastating this gap in scientific knowledge is. We knew a great deal about vaccine development. We knew a great deal about virology. We knew a great deal about public health. But when COVID-19 struck the world, there were a number of issues with distribution, with scaling these different interventions, whether they were public health, whether they were medical-based, that really left a suboptimal impact on many around the world. And so, again, I want to return to this notion that scaling interventions is not the same as scaling impact, and our science of scaling ought to focus on scaling impact. And again, I think this is a shift in mindset from where we typically are at in the literature when we talk about scaling up innovations. And I'll give an example of how we've pulled this apart in our work, comparing or contrasting what scaling science is to discovery science, to applied science. In the health sciences, I would substitute the word implementation science here, and showing how scaling science might be different. I do think there are different motivations for these different domains of work that, once taken seriously, are quite interesting to pull apart. We know about the big difference between discovery and applied science or implementation science really being driven by, curiosity of researchers, and how important it is that we're allowed to use the freedom of our minds to ask deep questions about the world. And there's been this, complementary notion of, well, research should also be used to solve societal or planetary problems, and applied or implementation science has really taken that on. I think that when we think about not just solving problems, but whose problems, for what reason are we solving them, and what are the implications of solving those problems, we get into the realm of impact. And I believe, and I'm arguing, that that's an entirely different set of scientific questions. The next is around the means we use these. It's easy for me to put things into simple boxes here. I'm not pretending that the world is this clear as the columns demonstrate, but discovery science has really prioritized objectivity, and the audience has been the academic community, and the results have really been about trying to be reproducible and be valid and truthful. Applied science has, riffed on that a little to talk about, the means is not just being objective, it's being about being objective and useful. So utilization focus. The audience has really been about users, not so much sharing with your scientific community, but how do you get your research into the hands of clinicians, into the hands of physicians, et cetera. And so results have really not just been judged by how truthful they are, but how truthful and how actionable or useful they are. But I'm going to argue that scaling science actually really complicates this notion if what we care about is impact. I think it implies bringing principles, whether those are social principles or they are medical ethical principles. Those are deep questions we need to ask into the process or the means of science. think the audience is not just about those who are first going to use our research or our academic community. It's about the full range of people who will be impacted, the people who will fund our research, those who will enable it, those who will maybe compete with what we're doing in our research. And all of these characters might block or facilitate the fact that we actually achieve a positive impact. And they might actually be the most important judges of what impact is positive. And how do we use scientific methods to bring those judges into the process of making that assessment? And so I'd argue that the results, it's important that they're valid. It's important that they're useful or actionable. But what's critically important is that they're being shared and felt at an optimal level. And I think that's a very different scientific domain than just asking questions about their use. And I've been inspired by my one of my mentors and my PhD supervisor when I was at Stellenbosch, Jimmy, who as we discussed and debated a lot of these ideas, did really leave me with this inspiring point about the main aim of science is really to have an impact on society. It could be discovery, it could be implementation science, but if it's not leading to impacts on society that are considered, we're not really fully grasping the domain. And it's, I think, an excellent quote from when he founded the Cochrane Collaborative. And so, getting into what we found about this domain, and in that book, we lay these out in full detail. We talk about 4 principles for scaling science. And these were really the main elements that drove success in generating meaningful impact. And that doesn't mean the most impact. It means what we call an optimal impact or meaningful impact in the over 200 projects we reviewed from cross domains and disciplines. And so that led us to these 4 principles, which are called justification, and that's who decides we should scale. How's that decision made? Optimal scale, which rejects the bigger is better notion of scaling. Coordination, which really says that scaling is always happening in complex systems. So taking notice and appreciating those systems is a successful strategy. And finally, dynamic evaluation, or that learning is essential to scaling. As the world changes, your interventions are going to need to change. And so what I'm going to do here is pause briefly to let my collaborator, John, join us in a short video that's going to introduce these principles just a little further. So there'll be volume, and I'm sure ready.
We've talked a lot about developing a.
Sorry, Rob, we're missing the video. Worked earlier on when we tried. At the moment, we've got audio but no video. Hi, Robert, can you hear us? We seem to have lost you. Is somebody else able to confirm whether or not we've lost Robert? I hope it's not just on my side. Oh, not sure.
Also can't hear him, Jiren. Also
Okay.
can't hear him or see the video. So hopefully
Okay.
he will join shortly.
Yeah, he's still here, but I think it's some sort of internet access issue. We'll give it a moment. Thanks, Tracy. Apologies, everybody. I've tried to reach out to Robert via mail. I don't have a telephone number. And it seems. Oh, there we go. Hello, Robert. Welcome back. You're muted still.
Sorry about that.
We lost you when you launched the video. We got sound for the video, and then but no picture, and then it all went dead.
Huh. Okay. I'm sorry about that. Let me try it one more time. I think if that's all right.
And everyone, we tested it before the meeting.
Yeah,
and it
we
worked
did.
perfectly. So that's the nature of
Technology.
these sorts of things.
Okay. So I can see the chat, Jerome. If there's any problem when I try this again, just let me know.
Will do. Now we can see the picture.
You can see the picture, okay. Okay, so I'll start it over and let me know if you can hear it, please. And volume should be adjustable on your side, just to let you know.
And we can hear it as well.
You
Perfect.
can.
Thank you.
We've talked a lot about developing a different mindset for scaling. A mindset is not step-by-step directions. It's a way of navigating complexity. We learned to think differently about scaling from Southern innovators. And we shared what we learned as 4 principles: justification, optimal scale, coordination, and dynamic evaluation. The principles intersect, so addressing one often leads us to others. We dedicate a chapter to each principle in our book. I'll briefly summarize them here. The first principle of scaling that emerged from our work with Southern innovators is justification. Scaling must be justified in a public way. Scaling is a choice. We may feel pressure to scale from funders and peers, what we call the scaling imperative. But organizations choose whether or not to scale the impact of an innovation. Sometimes it's better not to scale. At others, it would be wrong not to. Because scaling affects others, the choice is shared with them, and it should be based on evidence and values. It's not enough that scaling impact creates change. It must be change that people want. The second principle is optimal scale. More is not always better. Rather than striving for maximum scale, we should seek optimal scale that balances multiple, often conflicting considerations. This requires a holistic view that we believe should incorporate 4 dimensions: magnitude, which probably gets the most attention. It's concerned with how much impact and how many are affected, as well as variety, which is concerned with the diverse collection of impacts created, equity, which addresses issues of fairness regarding who is helped and who is harmed, and sustainability, which is concerned with how long impacts last, how efforts to create impacts are nurtured, and how scaling contributes to robust social and natural worlds. The third principle is coordination. It acknowledges that scaling takes place in complex systems. To bring an innovation from first idea to optimal scale requires an evolving set of actors and a flexible scaling process. The fourth principle is dynamic evaluation. It starts with a simple but powerful idea. Scaling is an intervention. It's common to talk about scaling an intervention. At the same time, scaling is an intervention. When organizations scale, they act differently in order to change the magnitude, variety, equity, and sustainability of their impacts. However, scaling creates dynamic change. It's dynamic because the system in which organizations scale may be complex and rapidly changing on its own, and disrupted by efforts to scale. So it's vitally important to evaluate before, during, and after scaling. Developing a different mindset about scaling takes time, practice, and the participation of others. We hope we've helped you begin that process. There are topics that we didn't have time to discuss with you today, such as different ways of understanding impact, how organizations can manage their entire collection of impacts as they scale, impact risk, scaling pathways, and how to evaluate scaling in dynamic contexts. Scaling is a big topic, but there are free resources to help you learn more about it at the IDRC website, including our book. And we would be happy to help if we can. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for the brief interlude. I'm going to jump right back into my slides to wrap us up here. That was visible for all. Okay, so jumping back in, I think an important notion here is that to me, to us, I think this is a starting place. We're not offering a complete view of what scaling means or how to do it, but I think it's an important exploration, and it's an invitation that others start looking at this topic too and try to grow what we know. One institution that's doing that, and I'm excited to collaborate with, is the University of Laval in Quebec City, Canada. And a lot of work is going on there around deepening the science of scaling. Reporting guidelines are currently being developed, and this notion of scaling as a process of optimizing and optimizing along those 4 dimensions that John talked about: magnitude, variety, equity, and sustainability, are highlighted. And I think this is an important step in ensuring scaling is reported properly in the literature. This recent review of systematic reviews, an umbrella review undertaken by Dr. Corrara and colleagues, is kind of a breakthrough in the field. And just quickly, some of the policy points around this review were, the expansion of the science of scaling is really required if we want to focus on scaling impact and not just scaling innovations. That scaling literature is usually produced in the areas of infectious diseases or maternal mortality, where there are more innovations ready-made, and a shift of scaling science into NCDs, into chronic disease, where there are less innovations readily available, may be of great use. And particularly important is that there was a noticeable power imbalance between where scaling is happening and who's publishing on it. And so, very interestingly, a lot of the actual experience, a lot of the knowledge, a lot of the capacity for scaling is existing in the global south. But in the academic literature, and I don't think this is unique to health sciences either, where this review is done, there's a lot more publications being driven from the global north. That's a whole nother important conversation to have. And then I'm very excited about this piece coming out of the same group, where we're actually using the 4 principles as a lens on understanding scaling, and trying to unpack what it actually means in a particular case context. And I think that type of case example and learning will be really critical for understanding how these principles matter in the process of scaling impact and how they can be put to work. Another great example of work going on around the world is this scaling exchange. And so 18 colleagues from around the earth came together virtually to discuss the notion of scaling and how it was being addressed in their different fields. And Tobias Schonwetter here on the bottom is actually UCD prof, and on the top row is Petronella Chamanuka of your Agriculture Research Council in South Africa. But what they decided to do as a result of these discussions was publish this call to action from the Global South. And I was very excited to kind of come alongside this effort and see the similar notions around focusing on scaling impact primarily. Number 8, I'm particularly jazzed about, which is this notion of investing in scaling science. So really understanding not just how, but why and different ways scaling can affect impact in the world. And I'm, super interested to see that major funders, major northern institutions have come and said, we need to take more attention to this scaling exchange and these kind of examples or actions that have been given to us by this group of innovators from across the Global South. But then turning to the practical, which kind of moves us beyond the science, we're beginning to develop different tools and almost a pedagogy of ways we can implement these ideas. And so I think that's exciting for post-secondary institutions interested in teaching, interested in building a scaling science approach in the way that they're preparing students and preparing new professionals. And one example, just one, is this playbook we put together at IDRC, and we now give it to every funded researcher. And it really offers some ways to put those principles into a research project. So very practical ways to think about optimal scale or justification through a project. And if you want to take a look, just Google the Scaling Playbook. It's in 3 languages, freely accessible. And within it are different heuristics or different tools that help one move through the principles and actually put them into action in the context of their own project. So we've had some excellent feedback on how this actually helps develop a way of thinking around scaling science. There's another one that helps walk through those different dimensions of optimal scale. And this notion is spreading beyond IDRC for sure, and into different funding agencies as well. So the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation have recently funded a very large funding allotment in projects in social accountability, particularly women's voice and local ownership over reproductive health. And they're using the principles and the scaling science approach in Ethiopia, in Senegal, and in Pakistan, some very challenging contexts for reproductive health rights, specifically scaling impact in those domains. And they've seen this as a novel way to kind of tackle that challenge. So quite exciting to see how this comes to life. Just to wrap up, I want to say that that's not conclusive. That's the starting place. And I encourage and invite you, if this has been at all inspiring or challenging, to critique or to join or to contribute in the way that you feel would be most appropriate. I would love to continue this conversation at the University of Cape Town. Again, there's resources if you use your phone to grab the QR code and dig a little deeper. And then I just wanted to say thank you very much. It's really a pleasure. I apologize for the video mishap, but hopefully that didn't take too long before I got back online. So cheers, and please let's have some time for discussion if that's viable.
Thank you so much, Robert. It was a very interesting introduction to a concept that I hadn't heard anything about before. So I'm intrigued to actually go and find your book and look at some of that literature, try to understand that a little bit more in terms of the specifics, and in that way also look at how the practical ways of doing this are the interesting parts that I need to understand. So thank you very much for that very interesting talk. And I'm going to ask if anybody has any questions or commentary that they want to give. And Tracy is the first one with a hand up. Go ahead, Tracy.
Thank you very much, Robert, for accepting our invitation to come talk to us about this really interesting, a kind of emerging discipline, I guess. So the one thing I wanted to hear from you is a real life example And I think we've kind of had the theory, but could you share with us? I really like this notion of not just scaling an intervention, and scaling impact. And I don't know if there is an example that you can share with us for us just to understand that with a little bit of nuance.
Absolutely. I can do my best to summarize something right now, Tracy, and I can give you some resources to go a bit deeper too, and because there are multiple examples from our research of how that challenge has been tackled. Jerome, do you want me to jump in, or do you want to take a couple, or let me know what's best for you?
No, go ahead, jump in.
Okay, so there are a number of examples I can give, Tracy, and thank you again for the invitation too. This is fantastic. I think one that perhaps is interesting is in the domain of social accountability, and again dealing with sexual health for women. And in this particular case, it's after an instance of sexual violence. So it was a case we looked at in India that really dealt with, after reporting rape, the system that a woman would have to go through in the legal system and the health system to kind of, live out the instance of sexual violence that was perpetrated against them. And at the time in India, the rates of sexual violence and particularly rape were incredibly high, very problematic, and a lot of women were saying that it was like additionally traumatic to go through the process of reporting, which I think is not unique to India, very unfortunately. But this particular project began to develop those perspectives and really unpack them in advance to understand the pain points in the system. And what they were able to do was kind of identify from the perspective of these women what would be an outcome that would make them feel, better having reported than having just avoided the entire system after this crime had been viciously committed against you. And really taking that time at the outset to identify those factors, to listen to people, rather than just look for efficiency or speak to the officials within the different ministries and within the different, legal elements that were involved in this, the policing system in particular. They were able to describe an intervention and test it with people who had been through the system and were willing to participate in the project, to really say, okay, here is what would feel like an advantageous and optimal outcome from having reported that I didn't get before. So then they developed their intervention, and they really aimed to ensure that those different elements were what were prioritized. And so they really focused on not doing more of this intervention, which was a suite of packages, including a training service for police, a policy change of the judicial system. Instead of just doing more of the intervention and trying to roll it across different states, they really focused on continuing to speak to women who were going through the system and say, how are you feeling about this element of your experience? And through that process have been, in my view, and I'll send you the details on this, highly successful in actually focusing in on changing the experience. And there's a great quote actually in the book about this, and it's the notion that women began to and wanted to from the outset and began to feel they were not victims of sexual violence, but they were survivors. And I think that that's a horrific situation for anyone to be through, but it was amazing to see how the focus of the innovation was actually around the unmeasurable, the unquantifiable, not how many people were served by the intervention, but on the actual experience they had from it and the actual impact it had on them as individuals. And that was actually then, sorry, I'm going on a little bit here, but it's very exciting to me. That was actually then one of the underpinning factors that was identified as why it scaled, because people actually felt that it was making a difference for them. So they would actually, access these different programs and so on. And different non-governmental organizations would implement them and push governments to make these changes. So It's a complex story. I apologize if I'm a bit all over the place in that response, but I can send you some details on it too. A very exciting example of scaling impact and not just designing a program and scaling that program and how that was done.
Thanks, Robert. No, that's a great example, and it helps clarify how these aspects are put into practice. Thank you for that. Does anybody else have a question?
So if there isn't one, I
Yeah.
might then just follow up if I may, Jerome. So
Absolutely.
what is what exactly, using that very example, what would you then say is a key difference between scaling science and implementation science?
Great question,
Because
Tracy.
if you're talking about implementation science, the principles that you've just spoken about in terms of trying to speak to communities and ask what is it that they want, I'm just trying to unpack, from that example, what would you say highlight are the key differences then between that? I mean, I saw in the theory that we're talking about that what you're talking about is that it's complexity theory and it's a few other things. But when you use this example, this real example of being on the ground and doing something, what would you say was different about this approach versus just what we would normally use if we're saying we're going to be implementing a program and using implementation science and focusing on outcomes?
Right. That's a great question, and let me try to summarize quickly. This is very important, and I just want to have a caveat at the beginning. I don't think this is the way to do scaling science versus implementation science, but it's the example from this project, and I think that scaling in science needs many approaches, many different mechanisms. But in this example I've given, it really was that focus on bringing people's voices into the design of the program. And so, in the context in India, I should say it would have been, from my knowledge, much easier for the researchers to have gone to the Ministry of Women's Services and asked, what kind of program can we fund you to do, and where are their gaps? And that program would have probably been off the ground rolling, and would have been rolled out across many states in India with external funding. However, to take those steps to actually design the program before even speaking to the implementers and say, what is it that we need or that we want, I think was the main difference. If you think about that theory chart I had where I made the joke, things don't always fit in such clear boxes in real life. You're helping unpack that now. That move from at the top being about utilization or action. So I think we would have had more utilization of a program or more action on it. We had just asked the implementers what would work for them and what did they need funding for, to impact. And that last box under scaling science. And so that focus on what actually is going to make a difference in the world for the particular audience in this case. And I think that step they took to really justify what they were doing before moving into actioning it is an example of the difference between scaling science and implementation science. Not just about finding factors that will influence use, it's about finding factors that will influence actual impact, because they're not always the same in our reviews. And I just add to that quickly, it complicates things, as you said, it does, but I think that's why we need a science. That's why it's an important area of growth and critical reflection to help build that way of thinking.
Great. Thank you, Robert. Is anyone else who has a question? Okay, doesn't seem like it. So at that point, I think it's good to say we can wrap things up. And thank you so much for giving us this insight and for spending your time with us and making yourself available. And really appreciate that. I see Lionel has just come on. Did you have a comment, Lionel?
No, I was really just going to say thanks very much. Quite an interesting approach to. I mean, it's something that one almost needs to test a while and see what impact it has. So thanks very much for the presentation.
Thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity. And let's keep in touch. I'd love to do more. Thanks. Big chance.
Great stuff.
Thank you so much, Robert. And so
Thank
thank
you.
you to everyone who attended, and have a good evening and have a good day back there in Canada, Robert.
Yes. Thank you. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. Bye. Thank you, Jerome. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy.